Yeah.
So speaking about your work, Game of Thrones was one of the best fantasy series of all time, and widely acclaimed and loved by many people. Many of us here now, I think hopefully it's not a spoiler alert. Most people here have seen the ending and how the show ended. I won't ask. Now I won't.
I have said in other places, but I'll just repeat it here. No, it's not. The books are not going to end that way. They're not. David and Dan. I mean, yeah, someone asked me upstairs, do I have any regrets? And I thought of one regret. But yeah, the main regret I have is the books aren't done yet. And I still have 2 done. And I really never thought that would happen. By the time we sold these books to HBO, I had 4 books already published, and I was making a lot of progress on the 5th book. I was 5, but these books are like this. How could they possibly catch up to me? But they did. And that's a great part of that is my fault. But anyway, sorry, I interrupted.
So I'm not going to ask you whether you like the way the show ended or how the books are going to end. But if you could maybe provide, constructive criticism on what you think, because the final season received mixed reviews. What do you think could have been improved in the final season, which just as a storyteller, as an author?
I really can't answer that without giving away what I'm planning. Which, to be honest, maybe I shouldn't admit, but I've already admitted this in other interviews and things like that. So I'm screwed. I've always said there are 2 kinds of writers in the world, and I call them the gardeners and the architects. The architects, and I know many architects, they plan their novels or their series like an architect designing a building. If you've ever known an architect and they're building a new building, you look at the drawings and how many rooms are there going to be? What kind of roof is it going to have? Is it, where does the electricity run? They have everything decided. It's all there before they drive the first nail or dig the first hole. And there are writers like that who have everything laid out. And then there are gardeners who are like, I think I'd put an oak tree here. Let's dig a hole. We'll put the oak tree in. And maybe I don't want an oak tree. Maybe it'd be better if it's a willow. I don't know. I'll change my mind. And then they water it with their blood in the case of writers, and something grows or it doesn't grow, or it grows crooked. And then they get another idea and they add to it, and it comes alive that way. And there's no writer that I've ever met who's 100% an architect or 100% a gardener. It's always a mixture, but you do lean to one or another, and I'm definitely a gardener. Tolkien, I believe, was a gardener. If you know I'm sure you're all at Oxford, you probably know everything about Tolkien. But Lord of the Rings began as a sequel to The Hobbit. The Hobbit had done well, its funny little tale about a thief and a bunch of dwarves. And it had done well, then the publisher wanted more of them. So he started writing what became a lot bigger than a sequel to The Hobbit. So in the projects where we lived, you could not have dogs or cats. So if I wanted pets, and what kid doesn't want pets? I had turtles. And I got turtles from Woolworths, and they were 15 cents, and Woolworths was a dime store, so we called them dime store turtles. And I would buy the turtles, and you'd get them in a little plastic habitat, which had a fake palm tree in the middle, and on one side was gravel, and the other side you put water. And so I would buy them at Woolworth. Now, I also had a toy castle built by Marx. I learned that later when I started collecting. A tin castle built by Marx, and you got a set of rubber knights to play with. Maybe that's where I got hooked on knights. But the castle was just big enough for 2 of the turtle bowls to be in side by side, so that's where I kept my turtles. And the dime store turtles, I don't know if any of you ever had them. They're not like the most robust pets you can have. They sort of died easily. Some of them escaped the castle, and you never found them again. Occasionally, you would find one 6 months later under a refrigerator. But they were all, so I had to explain this. What was happening here? Obviously, the turtles lived in a castle. They were all lords and knights, and they were killing each other to get the throne. So I was making up, that's partly the beginning of Game of Thrones, Turtle Castle. Turtle Castle was my first fantasy. So I was writing a novel. I'd already published 4 or 5 novels. I'd crashed and burned once here. But I was working in television, but one summer I had no television assignments. I was waiting to get a job on another show, creating some pilots, maybe writing a feature. But there was nothing up in that particular summer. So I said, it's been a few years since I wrote a novel. I will start a new novel. And I started a novel that was part of my 1,000 Worlds science fiction series that I'd already published like 30 or 40 stories in. It was called Avalon. I'd been thinking about it for a long time. I was like 30, 40 pages into it. And then one day, it's like I woke up and there was this chapter where they find the direwolf pups in the summer snows. Summer snows, as I said, summer snow. It was always the summer snows. Where did that word come from? Why did I know? I had written some science fiction stories about distant planets that had weird seasons and all of that, so the seed was already planted, but that chapter just came from nowhere, and I don't know, people ask me about this. The ancient Greeks, the Romans, they had muses. The muse would come to you. Now, these days, scientists talk about the left brain and the right brain, and one is creative and the other one is analytical. What was it? Where did it come from? I don't know where it came from, but it was just like there. And it was there so vividly that I had to write it. So I put the novel aside and I wrote that chapter in like 3 days. And then when I finished it, I knew what the next chapter had to be. And then I knew what the next chapter had to be. I never went back to the science fiction novel. I just continued to work on what? On what was it? Well, it was the beginning of Game of Thrones, but I didn't, is this like a novella that I'm writing? No, it's too big for a novella, and so forth. And then at some point, I decided it was a novel, it was fantasy, it was a trilogy. Why was it a trilogy? Tolkien. Tolkien had written a trilogy. He didn't know he was writing a trilogy. He thought he was writing a very long book, but it was the 50s, and his publisher said, this book is too long to publish as one book. We'll divide it into 3. And that became a trilogy. Then it became a global bestseller. Then every other fantasy writer in the world started writing trilogies. That was what publishers were buying. It's fantasy, it has to be a trilogy. So I made mine a trilogy too. And the other thing I did, which was unusual for me, was I told my agents to take it out. I had like sample chapters. I had 4 or 5 sample chapters with different characters, That first chapter is Bran's point of view. But then when I wrote the second, I had should I stick with Bran? Is he the hero? No, I don't, no, he's too young. I'll write from Ned's point of view, or I'll write from Cersei's point, or Catelyn's point of view. And that set the structure of it with a limited point of view, but a large cast of characters and jumping between them. My earlier novels, and I'd had like 5 of them, I sold my first story in 1970, appeared in a 1971 issue of Galaxy. And then I wrote a lot of stories for 6 years. So I didn't publish my first novel until 1977, after I'd been for 6 years. I kept postponing doing novels because they were so big and complicated, and I was writing short stories. The way that a young writer broke in back in those days, I don't necessarily advise this for any of you guys because things keep changing, but in those days, you submitted, if you were a new writer, you submitted to a publisher, either by yourself or through an agent, sample chapters and outlines. So you'd write, like 50 pages of the beginning of the book, the sample chapters, and then an outline of the rest of it. Well, number one, I hated outlining because I was a gardener and not an architect. And also I was very uncertain about my ability to actually finish a huge piece of work, which is what a novel seemed to me. So instead, Dying at a Light, my first novel, I didn't even tell anyone I was working on it. I just worked on it, I wrote it, and it was all done. I sent it to my agent and said, oh, look, I wrote a novel. Here, go sell it. And thank you, he did. And that was the way I wrote all my novels to a certain point. But then I hit one of the bumps, and I had a novel that didn't do very well, and then they didn't want any more novels from me. So when I started writing what would become Game of Thrones, I said, I can't finish this thing. This is going to take me a long time. I got to do the chapters and outline thing that everybody else is doing. And thankfully, it worked. My agent took it out, and sample chapters and a very cursory 2-page outline. That hardly said anything, but they said you had to have an outline. I don't want to do an outline. I might change my mind. The story might go, but I have to have an outline. So I did, and we had 4 publishers bidding on it, and my career was launched. That was my British publisher. A few years back, actually did an exhibition where they found a letter with that little 2-page outline, and they put it on display in their offices. And fuck, no, I didn't mean any of that stuff. Forget that stuff.
What did
I
it
had
have?
felt an outline, and no.
What did the initial outline have?
Oh, it had love affairs that I would never touch now. It didn't really go into who was going to live and who was going to die, but the basic structure was there. I mean, you had the Lannisters and the Starks, and you had Dany on the other thing, and you had dragons, which was actually that was a decision that I wrestled with. Because remember, I was mostly writing science fiction, and one of the early ideas I had was, well, what if the dragons are not literally real? I'd written a number of quite successful stories, science fiction stories about people with psionic powers. They were telepaths, they were empaths, they could do things. And I thought, what if this Targaryen family are pyro people? They can set fires with their minds, and they have that power, and they're dealing with these other people who don't have that power. And I had a friend, another young writer, she sadly passed away a few years ago, Phyllis Eisenstein, a very talented fantasy writer. And I let her see some of the early chapters, and she said, George, you can't leave out the dragons. The dragons have to be real. Don't give me this pyro psychic dragon. No. And, yeah, she convinced me. So I threw out that shit, and I gave them real dragons. Thank God.
Now, just before we move on to audience question and answers, I want to tell everyone here, you said upstairs earlier that your favorite character is Tyrion Lannister.
Right.
Do you want to tell them why?
Well, Tyrion's a smart ass. And it's fun to write that kind of dialogue, somebody who can say something witty. Also, he's a dwarf, which is a handicap, is a disadvantage. And I think, for me, those characters have always been easier to write. The people who are struggling against something, not the person who is the most popular kid in school or who's the strongest person or something. I mean, even when I was a comic book fan, I always loved Peter Parker, Spider-Man, much better than I love Superboy. I mean, Superboy can do anything. He can fly faster than light, and he has X-ray vision, and he does everything. How does Superboy ever threaten? But Peter Parker was kind of like me. I sort of went to high school with Peter Parker. We were both in high school at the same time, and we both graduated at the same time, which was something that Marvel Comics did that DC never did. Did any of you comic book fans, do you know that? Do you remember that? DC Comics were perfectly circular. Nothing ever happened. I mean, there was Superman, and he had Lois Lane, and Clark Kent worked for the Daily Planet, and Jimmy Olsen was his friend, and there was Perry White, who is that. And something would happen, some villain would show up, or aliens would invade, and Superman would deal with it. And at the end, it would be exactly back where it started, you know? This Superman and Lois Lane thing, nothing ever happened in that relationship. They never got married. Well, of course, they never had sex, because it was the 50s. But they never got married, but they never broke up either.
Is that why you compensated with Game of Thrones? There's a lot of...
But Marvel Comics, you know, Peter Parker went through a bunch of girlfriends. He had Liz Allen, and then he had Betty Brant, and then he had Gwen Stacy, but she died, and then Mary Jane showed up, you know, and he was picked upon. He had a life, and things were happening, and that's what I liked about it, and that's what I wanted in books. Books where things happen, preferably things that I didn't expect to happen. I mean, the other thing that I kind of skipped over was my discovery of Tolkien. I had read a few fantasy things while I was reading science fiction, but it wasn't many published. But I came across an anthology little paperback anthology by Sprague de Camp. He was the editor. And it was called Sword and Sorcery, and it had all these sword and sorcery stories, which was more of a pulpy science fiction, and it had a Conan story in it. God, come on, Conan, Robert E. Howard. It had Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser. It had what was some of the other, the Chirelle of Jory, one of the first female things set in France during the medieval period. Great stories, especially the Conan story. And then, well, Conan was being reprinted then, so I read a bunch of those Conan stories. And if you're an 11, 12-year-old boy, just starting, the Conan stories are great, man. Robert E. Howard, and you got the Hyborian Age, and you got giant snakes and monsters, and you know, evil sorcerers, and scantily clad women. Those all appealed to me. And then you kept hearing about this Tolkien guy in the fanzines. He was supposed to be great, but he wasn't published in America yet, until Ace Books jumped his copyright and published illegal editions. And then I read one of them. And at first I remember reading this and saying, what the hell is this? Why is everybody... The first chapter is like a treatise on pipeweed. And then there's a birthday party. And then they're walking across the Shire, and like the villain is a farmer whose mushrooms they're stealing. Where are the scantily clad women and the giant snakes? I wasn't seeing any of them. But then you got to Rivendell, and you got to what was the place where they met Strider, the town? Bree, yes. And it just got better and better. And by the time we got through with Rivendell and we're into Moria, I was like, oh, this is the best book ever written in the history of humanity. And I was a complete Tolkien fan.
All right.
But then I didn't write it for 20 more years until. But Tolkien was still on my mind, and well as other people. And when I began Game of Thrones and put my agent, I said, yeah, it's going to be a trilogy, because that was what you did. You wrote trilogies. I got disabused of that pretty quickly. I mean, it was, and actually here in the United Kingdom, I was supposed to have a deadline to deliver the first book, and it was supposed to be about 800 manuscript pages. And I was on a trip to England to attend the World Science Fiction Convention here, and I had a meeting with my editor, and who pointed out that I seem to have 1,200 pages here, which is like 400 more, but it's not finished, and there are some characters I haven't even talked about. So I said, yeah, that first book, I think it's 2 books. So that's where Clash of Kings came from. Suddenly I wasn't writing a trilogy, I was writing a trilogy of 4 books. And it grew after that, and here I am today, and I'm still not finished. And and if any of you have podcasts or blogs or anything, and you go online and you say that you were here, instantly someone will post, what the fuck is he doing there at Oxford talking? Why isn't he at home writing Wind of Winter? What's he doing?